She only asked for food, but when the homeless girl touched the piano, the entire ballroom froze, and what happened next shocked the world. The chandeliers of the Continental Hotel dripped with light like frozen waterfalls, their brilliance pouring down over gowns of silk and tuxedos pressed to perfection. Laughter rose in gentle waves, champagne glasses tilted, and a string quartet played quietly in the corner, the soundtrack of a world wrapped in privilege. Then a sound cut through it all, sharp and fragile, the kind of sound that makes heads turn and conversations fall mid-sentence. A girl's voice, small but steady. "May I play for food?" She could not have been more than 12. Her clothes hung loose, faded jeans and a sweater with frayed sleeves. A worn backpack clutched tightly against her chest as though it was the only thing standing between her and the vast, glittering room. The hush that followed was immediate. A platinum-haired woman froze with her glass midair, blinking as if her evening had been interrupted by a ghost. A man near the bar let out a short, incredulous laugh, muttering under his breath. Others craned their necks, searching for the source of the voice until their eyes landed on her. A child. Black. Tired. Out of place in a palace of glass and crystal. Whispers began to thread the air. Who let her in? Isn't there security? Someone snapped their fingers toward the entrance, already signaling for a guard. Yet the girl did not flinch. Her large eyes had fixed on a single point at the heart of the hall, and it wasn't the people or the chandeliers. It was the Steinway grand piano, gleaming black beneath the golden light, its lid lifted like wings. She stared at it as though it were not an instrument but a door she had been waiting her entire life to walk through. A ripple of laughter broke the silence. "Play for food?" A man in a navy suit smirked, shaking his head. "This isn't a subway station, sweetheart." His companions chuckled, the sound sharp against the marble walls. Still she stood, holding her backpack like a shield, her shoulders straight despite the snickers. One or two guests exchanged uneasy looks, but most were amused, even entertained by the spectacle. To them it was just a curiosity in an evening designed to remind themselves of their own generosity. Irony clung to the air like perfume. It was, after all, a gala to raise money for underprivileged youth. And here stood a child asking for nothing more than a plate of food in exchange for a song. The contradiction was so plain it made some guests uncomfortable, but not enough to silence the laughter. The girl did not retreat. Her voice came again, firmer this time, carrying across the marble hall with a surprising clarity. Just one song. There was no begging in her tone, no trembling apology. Only the faint edge of dignity, as if she had repeated this phrase in her head 1,000 times before daring to let it out. A waiter paused mid-step, tray balanced on his hand, eyes caught on her. The quartet in the corner faltered for a second, one violin bow slipping slightly out of rhythm before recovering. It was as if the entire room had been nudged off its axis by a single sentence. Security had not arrived yet. The distance between her and the piano stretched wide, but the way she stared at it gave the impression that nothing else in the room mattered. Not the mocking glances, not the glittering gowns, not the champagne that sparkled like liquid gold. She looked at the instrument the way a drowning person looks at the surface of the water, desperate, certain, unblinking. People could not stop watching her, though most would not admit it. For some, it was a spark of pity, for others, irritation at the intrusion. But buried beneath the judgments was something more subtle, something they would only understand much later. There was a quiet certainty in her stance, a whisper in her eyes that this was no accident. This girl had not stumbled in by mistake. She was here for a reason. What that reason was, no one could have guessed. Not yet. But as the murmur of disdain rose again, as laughter tried to bury her voice, a sense of unease coiled itself around the crystal chandeliers and the velvet curtains. Because even in her silence, standing there with a backpack and a question, the girl carried an invisible weight that unsettled the room. It was the kind of weight that suggested the night would not belong to the ones laughing, but to the one child who refused to bow her head. And somewhere deep inside the room, though no one realized it, the first thread of the story had already begun to pull tight. All eyes in the Continental Ballroom had locked on the girl as though she were a stain on the marble floor that refused to be scrubbed away. Conversations had stilled, glasses hovered midair, and the string quartet sat in frozen silence. The tension begged for someone to seize control of the scene, and she arrived with the certainty of a queen stepping onto her stage. Victoria Sterling, heir to a fortune and orchestrator of the evening, parted the crowd with deliberate steps. Her gown shimmered under the chandeliers, and in her hand a flute of champagne caught the light like liquid fire. She raised it high, the smile on her lips polished into perfection, and suddenly the humiliation of a child became her chosen entertainment. "Darling," she said, her voice smooth as silk dipped in venom, "what an amusing interruption." Laughter rippled obediently. A few guests clapped their hands softly as if applauding a comedian. Amelia did not move. Her fingers curled around the straps of her backpack, her gaze still tethered to the grand piano. The sight only emboldened Victoria. She thrived on these moments when the room bent to her performance. "Tell me, sweetheart," she continued, circling Amelia with the grace of a predator, "do you plan to play a concert for us tonight? In exchange for a meal?" How very poetic. The words dripped condescension, and the audience chuckled louder. Someone near the back whispered to his companion, "I bet she can't play a single note." Another replied, "I'll put 50 on her lasting less than a minute." Bets sprouted like weeds in fertile soil, laughter watering them with cruel delight. The humiliation transformed into a sport. Amelia's cheeks flushed but she did not drop her eyes. Her silence became unsettling, as though she carried a secret the others could not decipher. Victoria, sensing the tension, decided to raise the stakes. She lifted her glass again, letting the cut crystal catch the light before speaking. "Very well," she announced, her voice carrying across the ballroom. "Let us make this interesting. One song. That is all. And not of your choosing, my dear. Of ours." Gasps scattered through the room, followed by more laughter. A spectacle was forming, and they loved it. "If you succeed," Victoria continued, pausing to sip her champagne with exaggerated elegance, "I will personally ensure you have a proper dinner tonight. Perhaps even dessert." The promise carried no warmth, only mockery. "But when you fail, as we know you will leave this hall immediately and never return to trouble respectable society again." The room erupted in applause, the cruelty disguised as sport. Amelia stood motionless, her small frame dwarfed by the towering pillars and gleaming chandeliers. The deal was not designed to test talent, it was designed to crush spirit. And yet something in her eyes, steady, unflinching, suggested she had already endured storms far worse than this room of laughter. Victoria turned, scanning the crowd for a partner in her charade. Her gaze landed on James Morrison, a bar pianist known for his smug grin and mediocre skill. "James, darling, what shall she play?" James smirked, delighted by the sudden spotlight. "How about Beethoven's Für Elise?" Laughter burst out immediately. The choice seemed perfect. To the ignorant, it was a child's piece. To the trained, it was a minefield of precision and emotion. It was the perfect trap, easy enough to be mocked, hard enough to expose pretenders. "Wonderful," Victoria declared, clapping her hands once. "Every child who has ever touched a piano thinks they know it. No excuses for failure." The crowd pressed closer, hungry for the show. Whispers sharpened into predictions, "She'll butcher it in seconds. Maybe she won't even know which key is C. This is going to be fun." The noise swelled until it drowned the quiet dignity of the girl who had asked only for food. Yet not every pair of eyes glittered with malice. At the back of the hall, Dr. Robert Chun, a respected pianist and seasoned judge of competitions, leaned forward in his chair. While others smirked, he studied Amelia with a different gaze. He noticed how her eyes had not wavered from the piano, how her posture betrayed not confusion but a strange, steady familiarity. He had watched countless hopefuls approach the instrument, most trembling, some arrogant, but very few with that calm hunger. His instincts, honed over decades, whispered something he dared not voice. The girl might not be what she seemed. Victoria, oblivious, lifted her glass once more. "There we have it," she declared, her voice triumphant. "One song, chosen for you, played before us all. Play well and eat. Fail and vanish." The ballroom roared with approval, but beneath the laughter a thin crack had opened. A single pair of eyes, Dr. Chun's, saw not a beggar child but the faint outline of a musician waiting to be heard. And though the crowd could not know it yet, that quiet attention would change everything. Amelia walked toward the piano as if the crowd had melted away, her small sneakers squeaking against the polished marble floor. The guests expected hesitation, a clumsy shuffle, maybe even tears. What they saw instead was deliberate calm. She reached the bench and, without looking left or right, adjusted it with careful precision, sliding it forward an inch, lowering her posture, setting her feet just right. The kind of adjustment pianists make after years of habit, not something a hungry child picks up overnight. A murmur rippled through the crowd, subtle but undeniable. Dr. Robert Chun, still standing at the back, narrowed his eyes. He recognized those movements. They were not random. They were trained. Long ago, in a modest home filled with the scent of old books and polish on wood floors, Betty Washington would sit with her granddaughter in front of an upright piano that had lost its shine but not its soul. Betty's fingers, worn from decades of practice, would guide Amelia's tiny hands across the keys, whispering, "Music knows no prejudice, my dear. Notes do not care what color your skin is, or how much money is in your pocket. Music only knows truth." The little living room would fill with sound, and children from the neighborhood would gather outside the window, pressed against the glass to listen. Some nights Betty would invite them in, lining the small house with eager faces, teaching them claps and rhythms while Amelia played simple melodies. For 8 years, Amelia's world was shaped by that piano, the lessons repeating until they sank into her bones. Betty demanded posture, hand position, discipline, and expression. She spoke of Chopin's longing, Beethoven's battles, Mozart's joy, and she taught Amelia to hear beyond the notes. Then one morning, the house fell silent. Betty's heart gave out, and the music that had filled Amelia's childhood was cut short. The foster system took her away, placing her in cold dormitories where pianos did not exist. But the music refused to die. Amelia would lie awake at night, fingers twitching against her blanket, playing invisible keys in the dark. In shelters where children huddled close for warmth, she would close her eyes and hear the sound of her grandmother's voice, steady and soft, telling her to let the music speak when the world tried to silence her. Those invisible lessons became her refuge, her only constant. Now, standing before the gleaming Steinway, her fingers flexed unconsciously as if remembering every measure taught in that small living room. The audience saw a poor child about to embarrass herself. Dr. Chun saw something else. The way she placed her feet flat on the floor, the way her shoulders relaxed but her back stayed straight, the way her hands hovered above the keys with curved fingers, suspended, waiting. These were not accidents. They were habits forged over countless hours of practice. He felt a chill run down his spine. He had spent 30 years evaluating students, sitting through auditions where nervous hands trembled or arrogant ones slammed the keys. This child's composure was different. Too precise. Too ingrained. He leaned slightly toward the man beside him and whispered words that carried more weight than anyone yet understood. "That's no beginner." The ballroom had become an arena, every glittering face turned toward the piano where Amelia sat small and steady. Mocking voices filled the air like buzzing flies. $5 she can't play a single note," one man shouted, and laughter answered him like applause. A woman leaned forward on her chair, smirking, "Watch, she'll freeze." The energy in the room was sharp, hungry, waiting for a child's humiliation to become their evening's entertainment. Amelia did not look at them. Her eyes lowered to the keys, her breath even, her body perfectly aligned. She lifted her hands slowly and let them hover above the ivory, fingers curved in flawless position. Then she did nothing. Seconds stretched long, unbearable. The silence pressed against the guests, turning their laughter into nervous murmurs. Why was she waiting? Some chuckled, others whispered impatiently, but no one could take their eyes off the girl whose stillness commanded more attention than any toast or speech of the night. It was the kind of silence that could snap like glass at the smallest sound. Then it happened. Amelia pressed the first note. Clear, resonant, crystalline. It cut through the hall like a blade of light, vibrating with a purity no one expected. The chatter fell away at once. The man who had bet against her lowered his glass, the smirk slipping from his lips. A violinist from the quartet in the corner blinked, stunned by the tone that had risen from the piano. This was no fumbling attempt, no hesitant strike of an amateur. It was deliberate, clean, alive. She moved to the next note, and the next, the melody of Für Elise unfolding with a confidence that made a few guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. Their laughter died in their throats. The contrast was too sharp. A child in worn clothes, yet each note sounded as if she had been born inside the piano. Near the back, Dr. Chun leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with professional instinct. He studied the way Amelia's wrists lifted, the way her fingers released the keys with perfect weight and control. These were the marks of years of discipline, of training that could not be faked. His breath caught as realization sank deeper. She was not mimicking. She was not guessing. She was playing as one who knew. Victoria Sterling tried to mask her unease with a laugh. Beginner's luck, she said, her voice thinner than before, but no one responded. The audience had already shifted, caught in the pull of something they could not yet name. Amelia continued, her expression calm, her body moving with quiet rhythm, every gesture precise. Each second chipped away at the certainty of those who had mocked her. They had expected clumsy fingers, a crash of wrong notes, a quick retreat. Instead, they were watching control, mastery, something too rare to dismiss. The hush in the room deepened, a silence more profound than the cruel laughter that had filled it minutes earlier. Dr. Chun stepped forward without realizing, his gaze locked on the child at the keys. He whispered under his breath, not to anyone in particular, but as though the truth could not be contained. That's no beginner. The first notes had silenced the room, but as the melody unfolded the transformation became complete. The ballroom, once a place of glitter and chatter, now breathed like a concert hall. Amelia's small frame leaned into the piano with a focus that seemed impossible for her age, her fingers dancing across the keys with a precision that spoke of countless unseen hours. Each phrase of Für Elise came alive, not as a child's exercise but as a living story, woven with weight and tenderness. A waiter moving through the crowd stopped in his tracks, tray tilting until a glass slipped and shattered on the marble floor, but no one turned to look. Their eyes were locked on Amelia, as if she alone carried the power to hold them still. She reached the first difficult passage, where most students stumble, fingers tangling in descending arpeggios. Yet from her hands the notes spilled like water tumbling clear over polished stones, unbroken, precise, shimmering. A man near the front lowered his phone without realizing, the smirk long gone from his face. Somewhere to the left, a woman gasped, her hand trembling so hard the champagne flute tipped and splashed across her gown. She did not even notice. The music had drowned every other sound. The hush deepened until silence itself seemed to sing between Amelia's notes. Then, from the middle of the hall, came a soft sound no one expected, the catch of a sob. A woman pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, tears slipping down her cheeks, because the music was not just notes. It was grief and hope braided together, it was longing carried on small hands that should have known nothing but innocence. The guests looked at one another, uneasy. They had come expecting superiority confirmed, but what they felt now unsettled them to the core. Victoria Sterling stood rigid, her manicured fingers tightening around her champagne glass. Desperation pushed her to speak, her laugh high and strained. She must have memorized it from YouTube, she called out, but the attempt fell flat. The tremor in her voice betrayed her, and no one laughed with her. The air was too thick, too reverent. Amelia did not falter. She rose into the next phrase, shaping every note with a depth of emotion no tutorial could teach. The pauses she allowed between measures breathed like heartbeats, the silences carrying as much weight as the sound. Even those who had never studied music could feel it, the control of dynamics, the swell and retreat of sound that told a story without words. In those moments it felt as if her grandmother's spirit had slipped quietly into the hall, guiding her small hands. Each crescendo carried memory, each diminuendo whispered of loss, until the audience found themselves listening with their souls rather than their ears. Dr. Chun had moved closer now, unable to resist. His trained eyes followed every flick of the wrist, every subtle adjustment of touch. This was no performance cobbled together from imitation. It was mastery, and more than that, it was truth. His lips parted and he whispered, half to himself, half to the universe that demanded acknowledgement. This is not a child. This is an artist. The words hung in the air like a prophecy, unheard by most but destined to be proven in the notes that followed. Amelia reached the climax of the piece, where the familiar theme returned not with fragility but with force, transformed by the storm of the middle section. Her fingers struck with conviction, the melody ringing out proud and unyielding, as if declaring her very existence to those who had tried to erase it. The hall vibrated under the weight of it. Then, just as suddenly, she softened, the notes fading into whispers, delicate and haunting. The silence that followed between each phrase was unbearable, yet no one dared to breathe. The music had become larger than the room, larger than the night, larger than the prejudice that had filled it only minutes before. For those who watched, the girl at the piano was no longer a beggar. She was the storm and the calm after it, the voice of generations denied, the living echo of a grandmother's dream. And as the final notes of the passage hung trembling in the air, the audience realized with a shock that their laughter had been replaced by awe, and awe by reverence. Something extraordinary was unfolding, and nothing would ever quite be the same. When the final notes of Fur Elise faded into the high ceiling of the ballroom, silence settled over the room like a heavy curtain. Amelia kept her hands hovering above the keys for a breath, then another, as though reluctant to sever the connection between herself and the instrument. Only when the echo dissolved did she lower her hands, straighten her back, and turn to face the hall. The guests, once eager to laugh, now stared at her with eyes wide and unblinking. Champagne glasses hung motionless, conversations lay buried, and even the waiters stood frozen with trays suspended midair. Into that suffocating stillness, Amelia's voice carried clear and steady. "You're right," she said, and her tone was not timid but resolute. "I don't belong here." The word struck the audience like stones dropped into a still pond. Murmurs stirred, uncertain, bracing for her to retreat. But then her gaze lifted, and her voice sharpened with unexpected fire. "I belong on the world's greatest stage." Gasps rippled across the room. Some laughed nervously, unable to process the confidence of a child who only moments ago had asked for food. Victoria Sterling clutched her glass tighter, her knuckles pale, forcing out a brittle laugh. "How charming," she hissed, but her voice cracked under the weight of the silence. Amelia stood slowly from the bench, every movement deliberate, her small frame suddenly carrying the gravity of someone far older. "My name," she said, "is Amelia Washington." The name itself rang with quiet authority. At the back of the hall, Dr. Chun stiffened, his eyes widening as the syllables fell into place like puzzle pieces long forgotten. "Washington. Betty Washington." Amelia's next words confirmed it. "My grandmother was Betty Washington." A murmur surged through the crowd like a wave. Older musicians in the audience exchanged stunned looks, the name stirring buried memories. Dr. Chun pressed a hand to his mouth, whispering almost reverently, "My God. Betty Washington. She was one of the finest pianists this country never got to hear, barred from conservatories, pushed from concert halls, forced into teaching because of her color. And this girl was her blood. Amelia did not raise her voice, yet each word struck harder than the last. She said music was the one thing no one could take from me. Tonight she was right. The weight of truth spread like fire through the room, consuming the last remnants of scorn. Faces that had glowed with smug amusement now burned with shame. Victoria staggered, her mask of control crumbling. She opened her mouth but only stammered, "That proves nothing." "She's still," Amelia cut her off, not with anger but with calm that carried more force than fury. "I am also the youngest pianist ever accepted into Juilliard's Young Artists program. I am this year's national champion under 15. The words detonated in the silence. Guests glanced at one another, horrified to realize how wrong they had been. The humiliation meant for a child now wrapped itself around them like chains. Victoria shook her head violently, clinging to denial. "No," she spat, "you're just," but Amelia raised her backpack from beside the piano, unzipped it, and revealed a small black device blinking with red light. "Hidden cameras," she said plainly. "High-definition audio and video. Everything that happened here tonight has been recorded." The panic was immediate. Gasps turned into frantic whispers. Several guests grabbed their tickets, suddenly remembering the fine print about media rights. Phones were pulled out, scanning, searching for any clause that might protect them. It was useless. Amelia's calm voice cut through their chaos. "This will air nationally next month as part of a PBS documentary. The first installment focuses on how talent is dismissed when it does not fit privileged expectations. The second shows how those who claim to defend art reveal themselves when faced with it in unexpected form." Victoria's face drained of color. "You filmed us," she whispered. Amelia nodded. "The whole evening." Victoria's glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. She did not even flinch. Around her, the other guests shrank, realizing their cruelty would soon be preserved forever, streamed and shared until their reputations withered under the weight of their own words. Dr. Chun stepped forward at last, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and vindication. "She's not just a child," he declared, looking from face to face, "she is an artist, and tonight she showed you all exactly who you are." The hall fell silent again, but it was not the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of reckoning. The silence of people staring into a mirror they had never wanted to face. Amelia stood unshaken in the center of it all, a child no longer asking for food but delivering judgment, her truth shining brighter than the chandeliers above her. 6 months later the lights of Carnegie Hall burned brighter than ever, 1,000 bulbs blazing against the polished wood and gold leaf of America's most sacred stage. Outside, crowds pressed against velvet ropes while cameras flashed, reporters jostling for position. In the middle of it all stepped Amelia Washington, no longer the girl in worn clothes clutching a backpack but a young artist in a flowing concert gown, her hair pulled back, her eyes steady as she waved to the sea of lenses. The transformation was not only in her appearance but in the weight of the world now leaning toward her instead of against her. The documentary had already shaken the nation. Faces of Discrimination aired on PBS and then flooded across YouTube and social media, climbing past 20 million views. Clip after clip of that night at the Continental was replayed, dissected, shared, until the cruelty of the wealthy crowd became a symbol of arrogance and the image of Amelia at the piano became an anthem of truth. Conservatories across the country announced reforms. New scholarships were founded in her name, doors long bolted against children without privilege were forced open. Community music programs bloomed in neighborhoods that had never seen a single violin or piano before. The phrase "play for food" became shorthand for the resilience of talent ignored until it demanded recognition. For Amelia, the change was both immense and strangely simple. Where once she had played on invisible keyboards in dark shelters, she now practiced on Steinways in grand rehearsal halls. Where once she had stood begging for a chance, she now stood as the youngest soloist of the season, booked to debut on the most revered stage of them all. Yet in her eyes there remained the same quiet dignity, the same unshaken resolve that had carried her into that ballroom of scorn and turned it into a hall of revelation. Victoria Sterling was nowhere near Carnegie Hall that night. Her name had become poison in the social circles she once ruled. Exposed as the face of elitist cruelty, she lost her clients, her charitable board seats, and finally the glittering friends who had once applauded her superiority. Photographers still followed her, but only to capture the fall, to frame the once untouchable hostess now exiting small offices with hunched shoulders, her reputation shredded beyond repair. The irony was brutal. She had wanted the spotlight, and she had received it, but in the form of permanent humiliation. Inside Carnegie Hall, the audience rose to their feet before Amelia even touched the keys. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised, ready to witness the next chapter of a story that had already shifted a nation's conversation about art, privilege, and prejudice. When Amelia sat at the grand piano, the hush that descended felt familiar, like the silence before a storm. She took her breath, placed her hands, and began. The sound filled the hall, but more than sound, it carried history. Each note was layered with memory, with loss and endurance, with the echo of a grandmother's voice. Music knows no color, Betty Washington had said long ago. No class. No chains. Only truth. And now that truth rang from the stage of Carnegie Hall, carried on the fingers of the girl who had once asked to play for food. As the final chords lifted and dissolved, the ovation came like thunder, shaking the hall in waves. Amelia rose, bowed with grace, and for a moment stood still as the applause washed over her. She did not smile in arrogance. She did not bask in triumph. She simply carried the look of someone who had fulfilled a promise made long ago in a modest living room with a battered upright piano. For the millions who would watch that performance online, for the audience that witnessed it in person, the message was unmistakable. True greatness does not need permission. It only needs a chance to be heard. And as Amelia walked off stage that night, her grandmother's words remained, not just as memory but as prophecy fulfilled: music knows no color. No class. No chains. Only truth. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.